bombshell news here, the news that we've been waiting for. Judge Chutkan in Washington, D.C. has unsealed this 165-page motion, this filing that was submitted by Jack Smith. This will form the basis of this mini trial that will ultimately be litigated to determine what falls under the umbrella of official conduct that Donald Trump could be prosecuted for. So there is a lot in this filing. I'm going to read certain portions here. And Glenn, if you can expound on them and explain what the legal implications of everything I read are, I think that would be the most helpful way to do this. And a lot of what I'm about to read are beyond damning here. So I think we can start off with this. Donald Trump had told certain advisors, and the advisors' names are redacted, but he had told his advisors before the 2020 election that he would simply declare victory before all the ballots were counted. What does that do to Donald Trump, legally speaking?
Brian, the conspiracy was formed long before the results were in, long before all of the votes were counted. I have to tell you, I am plowing my way through this 165-page motion, but our viewers shouldn't think of it as a legal filing. This is the opening statement.
Why does your internet always buffer at the worst moment? Is your
65-page opening statement, and it reads like a darn crime thriller, even though we know who done it. Donald Trump done it. But now, everybody will have the opportunity to see for themselves what Donald Trump did it, how he did it, with whom he did it, and the fact that they had this criminal plan, this corrupt scheme in place to say, listen, we don't care about the expressed will of the American voters. We're just going to declare victory, and then everything we say and do will be sort of to push that false narrative. And I'll tell you, this is probably a 10 on the legal Richter scale, this 165-page opening statement. On a scale of 1 to 10, Brian, it's a 10 on the legal Richter scale. But I have to tell you, on the political Richter scale, this thing is like a 1,006. I mean, I just hope everybody sits back, takes the time to read it, and I know we're going to go through as much of it as we can, as quickly and concisely as we can, but it's no substitute for people to then go back, take the time, and read it, and see what Donald Trump did in these democracy-busting crimes.
Okay, Glenn, the next one here that I want to touch on is that a Trump campaign employee and an alleged co-conspirator sought to foment violence at the TCF ballot processing center. That is the one in Detroit. And I'm going to read a quote here. Quote, "We think a batch of votes heavily in Biden's favor is right. Find a reason it isn't. Give me options to file litigation, even if it is." Then the colleague suggested that there was about to be unrest, reminiscent of the Brooks Brothers riot. And this other co-conspirator responded, "Make them riot, do it." So again, looking to foment violence here.
Yeah, looking to foment violence to disrupt and mislead and try to steal a presidential election. This is another example of it. This is one of what we would call the overt acts. What's an overt act? Well, the criminal conspiracy was formed, and I want to talk in a few minutes about just how big this criminal conspiracy might be based on this 165-page opening statement. The criminal conspiracy was formed, right? We're just going to declare victory, notwithstanding the actual vote count. And then everything we see as we move through this court filing, these things are overt acts. An overt act is basically a step that one or more of the co-conspirators takes toward the commission of the crime. And this fomenting violence at the Detroit vote counting center to try to disrupt the counting of the votes is one of those overt acts. And each and every one will further bolster Donald Trump's criminal responsibility. And I know we're going to move through several of them, but this is relating some of what the co-conspirators said and did. But here is why that's so important. People should keep in mind that once a conspiracy is formed, Brian, everything that every co-conspirator says and does is legally attributable to every other co-conspirator. In other words, once you join a criminal conspiracy, as Donald Trump did, you now suffer the consequences of every crime and every incriminating statement made by every member of the conspiracy. And that is why when we go through what these co-conspirators that weren't Donald Trump, what others did and said in furtherance of the conspiracy, think about it. It's all evidence of Donald Trump's crime that can and will be introduced him at his ultimate trial.
Another point that Jack Smith brought up is that Mike Pence had told Donald Trump that he'd seen no evidence of outcome determinative fraud in the election. Jack Smith wrote, "This was one of many conversations the defendant, meaning Donald Trump, and Pence had as running mates in which they discussed their shared electoral interests. Pence gradually and gently tried to convince the defendant to accept the lawful results of the election, even if it meant they lost." So what are the implications of this, of Donald Trump spreading the big lie, knowing full well that A, he had lost, and we know numerous instances where he was told that he was lost, and B, knowing in retrospect that he would go on to then try to pressure Mike Pence on January 6th into doing something that Mike Pence had already revealed he had no interest in doing.
Brian, this is evidentiary gold against Donald Trump. Why do I say that? Because anytime you have a witness who can testify to a jury, wait a minute, I told Donald Trump myself, and he heard it, and he acknowledged that he heard it, that there was no fraud undermining the election's results. Mr. President, you lost. When you can get that one-on-one conversation before a jury, not hearsay, not third hand, not a news account, not what somebody wrote in a book, but a one-on-one conversation from an eyewitness who can directly tell the jury, I told Donald Trump he lost. He essentially said, I don't care. We're going to keep on keeping on with our criminal scheme by which I'm going to try to steal the presidency. I'm telling you, talk about a nail in Donald Trump's legal coffin. You know, Mike Pence will be a marquee witness at Donald Trump's trial. And the reason this information about Pence becomes more and more important is because the Supreme Court said, well, you know, presidents get to talk to their vice president, so maybe he should have some immunity unless
Meet Voto AI, the photo editing software that everyone's
crime and corruption, and Donald Trump is acting as a candidate trying to steal an election, not as a president of the United States trying to enforce the laws of our nation. And that is another reason Jack Smith is including this information about a conversation between Pence and Trump by which Trump knew he lost the election, and that provides evidence of Donald Trump's what? His criminal intent, his corrupt state of mind. Huge piece of evidence.
We also have evidence in the filing that Jack Smith will introduce instances in which Donald Trump and his co-conspirators basically made up all of their claims about non-citizens, about illegal aliens voting in the election out of whole cloth. For example, the conspirators started with the allegation that 36,000 non-citizens voted in Arizona. 5 days later, it was a few hundred thousand. 3 weeks later, the bare minimum was 40 or 50,000. The reality is 250,000. Days later, it was 32,000. Then it went back to 36,000. So again, just picking numbers out of whole cloth. What are the implications of this claim?
So, Brian, the fact that they have evidence that they will introduce about knowingly false claims of voter fraud by immigrants or by anybody, dead folk voting, all of that nonsense, it all helps establish that this was a multi-pronged, multi-front effort to try to steal this election by hook or by crook. And they were deploying all of these different vehicles to do that, whether it's pressuring Mike Pence not to certify the results of the election, whether it is insisting that secretaries of state just magically find 11,780 votes, enough to corruptly declare Trump the winner, or by saying there's a whole lot of immigrants and dead folk voting. It is a multi-pronged, multifaceted attack on the election. And here's the other thing. You know, Jack Smith has to prove that these things were not official acts of the president. So the more information and evidence that we see like this, like Donald Trump and his criminal associates conspiring to falsely, knowingly, intentionally, falsely claim folk are voting who don't have a right to vote, that helps take it out of the presidential immunity realm, because it is never an official duty of a president of the United States to get together with his criminal associates to lie to the American people about voter fraud that everybody knew didn't exist. Again, evidentiary gold.
Further proving that point, we have another piece in the filing where Mark Meadows and an unnamed White House lawyer exchanged text messages on December 3rd, 2020, confirming that a statistic that had been repeated regarding dead voters was just outright false. So just more evidence on that exact point. Glenn, we also have another piece in the filing that outlines how a U.S. senator, also unnamed right now, helped facilitate a December 8th call between Trump and the Georgia Attorney General. So what does it mean wherein we have sitting Republican senators who are facilitating calls between Donald Trump and these state officials, where the purpose of them, again, not unlike what we saw between Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, was to attempt to subvert the election or for Donald Trump to wage his pressure campaign?
Brian, a la the movie Jaws, we're going to need a bigger boat. It means we're going to need a bigger indictment. And we are probably going to see a bigger indictment. I'm so glad you brought that reference to a U.S. senator who may be criminally complicit, not completely clear. Only Jack Smith knows for sure, but maybe being criminally complicit in Donald Trump's conspiracy. And here is what I was really taken by when I was just making my way through this 165-page opening statement. I have not read it all, but I did jump to the end to see how many people, how many potential co-defendants there are in this indictment. Now, everybody will soon realize, if they look at this 165-page opening statement, that Jack Smith blacked out almost all of the names, and he entered numbers and other designations for all of these people. They are either CC1, CC2, CC3. What is that? Co-conspirator. And we already knew, courtesy of the earlier Trump indictment, there are at least 6 co-conspirators. But then beyond that, because he hasn't yet named or indicated there are other co-conspirators, he started to give them the designation P1. What is P1? Private or political operative of Donald Trump. And when you start looking through all of the P1s, P2s, P3s, you can tell by what Jack Smith relates about the conduct of these private political operatives that a lot of them are going to have criminal liability and are probably going to end up as indicted co-conspirators someday. This thing is long from over. We're going to see other federal indictments drop, I promise you, with other indicted co-conspirators over and above the 6 unindicted co-conspirators that Jack Smith included earlier in an indictment. And I jumped to the end, Brian. Why? Because I wanted to see how many private political operatives there were. Well, I hope everybody's sitting down. 77.
Does that mean that we can actually?
I'm sorry.
Does that mean we can actually see? I mean, if this turns into some RICO prosecution, I know right now Jack Smith built this case for speed, but we've spoken about in the past when you have these unindicted co-conspirators, that means it's pretty much just a matter of time until they're actually indicted as well. So does that mean that we can see a RICO prosecution with 77 co-defendants?
Not necessarily, and here's why I say that. I think Watergate corralled about 48 people who were ultimately charged. This makes, Watergate look like basically shoplifting, okay?
Yeah.
And just because there are 77 political operatives included in this opening statement, it does not mean that all 77 necessarily have criminal exposure, or even if they do have some minimal criminal exposure, Jack Smith may just want to use some of these people as straight up witnesses rather than charging them, flipping them, and converting them into cooperating witnesses, somebody who pleads guilty and agrees to testify truthfully at the trials of others. But when I saw that P77 and I looked at what some of these characters were alleged to have done, we're going to have lots and lots and lots more co-defendants added in the future. Not necessarily all of them, but Jack Smith is far from done issuing federal indictments in this case.
On the issue of
fundamentally alter the Trump financial landscape. I am holding the licensing termination notice. Before you dismiss this as just another business setback, understand what this represents. I've built cases for 30 years, prosecuted financial fraud at the federal level, and I know what corporate dissolution looks like when powerful entities move to protect themselves. This is not speculation. This is documented severance of business relationships that generated hundreds of millions in licensing revenue. Let me show you exactly what happened. The notice arrived via certified mail to Trump Organization headquarters on May 4th at 2:14 p.m. Page 3, paragraph 7 states the termination is effective immediately for all merchandise licensing agreements across 17 product categories. We are talking about clothing lines, accessories, home goods, fragrances, eyewear, footwear, leather products, watches, cufflinks, bedding, furniture, lighting, cologne, vitamins, steaks, and bottled water. Every single licensing deal, gone. The termination clause references material breach of brand standards provisions contained in Section 12. 4 of the Master Licensing Framework Agreement executed March 2019. Here's what the document actually says. Quote, licensor hereby exercises termination rights pursuant to Morals Clause invocation based on ongoing reputational damage that materially impairs commercial viability of licensed marks. End quote. Let me translate what that means in plain English. You have heard the term Morals Clause. Here is what it actually means in commercial licensing agreements. When a celebrity or public figure licenses their name to manufacturers, those contracts include provisions allowing manufacturers to terminate if the person's reputation becomes so damaged it hurts sales. Outside court, you would call it the bad publicity escape hatch. In my experience prosecuting fraud cases, I have seen these clauses invoked maybe a dozen times in 30 years. They appear in every major licensing deal, but almost never get used because the threshold for reputational damage is extremely high. The manufacturer has to prove the name recognition that made the deal valuable has now become a liability. That is exactly what 17 different licensing partners concluded simultaneously. The manufacturers did not make this decision lightly. Each termination triggers contractual penalties for early exit. We are looking at liquidated damages provisions that could cost these companies between $2 and $8 million per terminated agreement. They are willing to pay those penalties to stop associating their products with the Trump name. That tells you everything about how toxic the brand has become in commercial markets. When I prosecuted racketeering cases, we followed the money. The money just ran away from this partnership. Now let me show you the timeline. On April 12th, the New York civil fraud judgment entered final enforcement phase. On April 19th, Trump media stock dropped 43% in 5 trading days. On April 26th, licensing partners requested emergency board meetings. On May 2nd, legal counsel circulated termination notice templates. On May 4th at 2:14 p.m., 17 termination notices arrived simultaneously. Once is an accident, twice is coincidence, 3 times is a pattern. But here is what makes this particularly devastating. The metadata shows documents prepared by Sullivan and Cromwell, one of the most elite corporate law firms in America. These are Fortune 500 companies with dedicated legal departments who paid premium rates to ensure bulletproof termination. The preparation timeline indicates 3 weeks of legal review. Every possible contractual vulnerability was analyzed. This was surgical corporate divorce executed to prevent legal recourse. Let me walk you through what this means financially. In fiscal year 2022, licensing revenue represented approximately $237 million in gross receipts to the Trump Organization, according to financial disclosure documents filed with the Office of Government Ethics. That number appears on page 47 of the annual report. The licensing agreements operated on tiered royalty structures, typically ranging from 12 to 18% of wholesale value. Removing 17 product categories eliminates roughly 81% of that licensing portfolio. We are looking at approximately $192 million in annual revenue that just vanished. Gone. That is not cumulative loss over years. That is annual recurring revenue that stops flowing immediately. Now let me show you how this compounds existing financial pressure. The New York civil fraud judgment totals $454 million plus interest accruing at approximately 9% annually. That interest adds roughly $112,000 every single day. Asset seizure proceedings began April 1st, targeting liquid accounts and marketable securities. The cash burn rate to cover legal fees across 4 simultaneous prosecutions runs approximately $7 million monthly based on court filing disclosures. Now subtract $192 million in annual licensing revenue, and you fundamentally alter the cash flow equation that determines whether someone can meet financial obligations or faces insolvency. Warren Buffett was asked about this development during the Berkshire Hathaway annual meeting yesterday. Let me read you exactly what he said. This is from the shareholder Q&A session transcript, page 134, lines 18 through 27. Quote, "When you see coordinated corporate flight from a brand name, that tells you market forces have rendered a verdict that transcends political polarization. Businesses exist to generate profit. If they are walking away from revenue despite contractual penalties, they have calculated that association costs exceed termination costs. That is market discipline functioning as designed." End quote. Think about what Buffett just articulated. The Oracle of Omaha, someone who built his entire investing philosophy on long-term value recognition, just told shareholders that markets have concluded the Trump brand creates more liability than value. That is not partisan commentary. That is cold financial analysis from someone whose track record speaks for itself. I know this feels overwhelming. I read your comments every day asking how someone continues operating with this level of financial pressure. Here is what you need to understand. This is not about politics. This is about whether basic commercial accountability functions when someone's actions create brand toxicity that damages everyone associated with that name. These licensing partners are not making political statements. They are protecting shareholder value. They are responding to market research showing consumer rejection rates that make continued association unsustainable. Let me show you the market research that drove these decisions. Consumer sentiment polling conducted March 2025 shows devastating numbers. For menswear, 68% of target consumers would actively avoid Trump-branded products. Home goods, 73%. Fragrances, 79%. When 3/4 of your customer base rejects your brand name, you have passed the viability threshold. But here is what makes this a broader pattern beyond just business setbacks. This is the 4th major institutional separation we have documented in 16 months. In January 2024, the PGA pulled championship tournaments from Trump golf properties. In July 2024, Deutsche Bank terminated all remaining banking relationships and accelerated loan repayment schedules. In November 2024, the Republican National Committee relocated its donor database and fundraising infrastructure away from Trump-controlled servers. Now in May 2025, 17 merchandise licensing partners execute coordinated brand divorce. Once is an accident, twice is coincidence, 3 times is a pattern, 4 times is institutional consensus that association creates more risk than value. Let me know in the comments, when you see Fortune 500 companies willing to pay millions in early termination penalties to stop associating with a name, does that change how you view the commercial viability of that brand? I read every comment. Now let me show you what happens next. The licensing termination notices include 30-day wind-down provisions. All existing inventory carrying Trump branding must be sold through or destroyed by June 4th. No new production runs. No reorders. Retailers have already received notification that these product lines are discontinued. The manufacturers are required to file final royalty reports by June 15th covering sales through the termination date. After that, the revenue stream stops completely. The contracts include confidentiality provisions prohibiting either party from publicly discussing the termination for 12 months, which explains why this happened quietly without advance media coverage. But the court filings are public record. The termination notices were filed with the New York Secretary of State on May 5th as required for dissolution of commercial partnerships. Docket entry number 2847. Anyone can verify this. Here is what the financial disclosures will show over the next 2 quarters. The Q2 2025 earnings report due August 15th will reflect partial quarter licensing revenue showing significant decline. The Q3 2025 report due November 15th will show the first full quarter with 0 licensing revenue from these 17 product categories. Watch those disclosure documents. The numbers will confirm exactly what these termination notices established. This is not speculation about future developments. This is documented current reality with predictable financial consequences that will appear in mandatory disclosure filings. The broader pattern reveals something that transcends individual business relationships. We are watching market-based accountability function exactly as economic theory predicts. When brand association creates measurable financial damage, rational economic actors sever those associations regardless of political considerations. The manufacturers did not coordinate this termination because of partisan agenda. They made identical risk calculations based on identical market research showing identical consumer rejection patterns. That is how markets discipline brand value. When a name stops generating premium pricing and starts generating customer avoidance, that name becomes worthless as licensing property. I know some of you are thinking this represents political persecution. Let me be clear. I have built cases for 30 years. I have seen actual conspiracy. This is not that. This is 17 independent companies reaching identical conclusions based on market research showing consumer sentiment has reached unsustainable levels. The simultaneity reflects shared market intelligence, not coordinated attack. Business leaders are seeing devastating internal data. Customer focus groups expressing active hostility. Sales representatives reporting retail resistance. Market research projecting 3 to 5 year recovery timeline. Board members asking why the company continues paying royalties for brand association that depresses sales. Fiduciary duty to shareholders requires acknowledging reality. The Trump Organization will dispute this. They will claim political targeting. But 17 manufacturers looked at market data, consulted legal counsel, calculated penalties, and concluded that paying millions to exit served shareholder interests better than continuing these partnerships. Rendered final judgment on brand viability, or do you see this differently? Let me know in the comments.